us. I wanted to welcome you to our week 6 seminar for the winter quarter. Really delighted and looking forward to today's talk. Couple things I wanted to mention to you, just to remind those of you who haven't been attending our seminar. For those of you who have, this will be same old, but the way we manage Q&A is we ask you to post your question in the Q&A box, which is not the chat box, but it's a button along the bottom of your Zoom bar. And those Q&As we can take, take as they come in, or we'll take at the end, but it's a nice way for everyone to see the question and the answer. And we'll usually, for those of you who ask a question, type a question in the Q&A, we can bring you into the room, into the Zoom room, and have you ask the question in person, so to speak. But it's a nice way to gather up questions. If you have some technical issues and you want to communicate with the host and the panelists, you can send us the chat, and that's fine. I'd also like to remind you all that after, we're really lucky that Dr. Sewell has agreed to meet with students and talk about their research and their career and interact with you as students. And that post-seminar student discussion will be moderated by Maxine Wright, one of our CSD trainees and sociologists. And Jessica Godwin just posted a link for that Zoom in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the host of our session. We're really delighted to have Professor LaShonda Pittman introduce our speaker. I'd also like to say 2 wonderful things, only because there are many wonderful things to say about Professor Pittman. But the first is Professor Pittman was a member of the committee that helped put together this year's seminar series, and we're so lucky. We've got had a great group of invited speakers, and including Dr. Sewell today. Also, wonderful, great news. Professor Pittman just heard that her tenure was approved just a few hours ago, and we're really happy about that. It's just fantastic for CSDE and the UW community. Professor Pittman is a professor of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington and a sociologist who examines questions at the intersection of race, gender, and family. And as such, her work is squarely situated within CSDE's primary research area, the well-being of families and households. And we're really lucky to count her in our community of scholars. And without further ado, I'm hoping I have a thumbs up from Dr. Sewell that we can go forward. But without further ado, I'll have Dr. Pittman introduce Dr. Sewell.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate you and appreciate CSDE and the folks that I worked with over the summer, especially to organize this year's speaker series. We've got so many incredible people, including Dr. Sewell, who I'm really excited to introduce. I followed Dr. Sewell's career trajectory over the years and have completely admired their work from afar. And so it's just really great to see this culminate into Dr. Sewell's talk today. So Dr. Ali Sewell is an associate professor of sociology at Emory University and incredibly the founder and director of the Race and Policing Project. Advancing quantitative approaches to racism studies, they assess empirical links between the political economy of race and racial health, including healthcare, disparities using policing and housing policy data. Published in a wide array of sociological and interdisciplinary outlets, their research garnered support and recognition from the National Institutes of Health, the Ford Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, the Baden Furtenberg Foundation, and the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. So again, you can see why I've followed Dr. Sewell's work over the years. Planned Parenthood named them the future innovator and visionary who will transform Black communities. They received their PhD and MA in sociology from Indiana University with a minor in social science research methods, and their BA summa cum laude in sociology from the University of Florida with a minor in women's studies. I also want to mention that we had slated Dr. Sewell for the fall, but they had a calendar conflict when they were named the GSA Sociologist of the Year, so the Georgia Sociological Association, where Dr. Sewell also gave a keynote address at that year's meeting. So I'm really, really excited to bring Allie into this incredible space and community.
Uh-oh. I think
And they
I
have
lost
dropped off.
Dr. Sewell. Maybe she went to a computer.
Yeah, they were having technical difficulties, so I imagine they might have changed computers and will be jumping back in. I'm going to shoot them an email, Sarah.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Are you there?
Awesome.
Okay.
Can you see me?
We can see you. We can hear
Awesome.
you. Everything is.
I see that I'm on a network that should be able to hold me up for another 45 minutes. I do apologize. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Dr. Pittman, number one, congratulations. Welcome to the next 30 years or so.
Thank you, Dr.
It's
Sewell.
really my pleasure to be here. I do appreciate y'all being able to reschedule and kind of go through the works with me. It's really been a delight to follow this kind of work for some time and to kind of accept the different types of titles people put on me, including demography and population studies, different health disparities, neighborhood effects research, sociology, pick one. I think that this where I am now with this project is really a combination of the full range of things that happen when you just decide that you're going to figure it out. In about, maybe about, 10 years ago in graduate school, I said, I really want to study racism, but not the one that you can see. And I started that question kind of got me down this road. And I will tell you, it's been a fishing trip. And you don't always get what you're looking for, number one, and you don't always get what you understand. And sometimes you find things that become this concoction of ideas that seem to always been there, but you just didn't have enough of the pieces. And this is one of those places that I'm in now. All it takes is one block. The legacy of redlining and lethally and surveilled neighborhoods. I think we'll start one place, which is kind of where the research that you see is, and then I want to link it back to kind of where I started, which is that I want to study structural racism, and then end with where I know I'm going with this is a much more I would say kind of a quantitative ethnographer, if there was ever one. That's kind of where I'm going. So again, kind of bear with me. I'm hoping that if there are issues with the the pacing of things, if you can maybe put something in the chat or say something, because I do think there may be some issues, and so I am going to slow down to make sure that you catch as much of this as possible. So we start with this question of police brutality and particularly the way it's been framed within public health, right? As sociologists, we may think about policing and surveillance and these broader questions, but the term brutality feels very kind of itchy for us. It feels a little uncomfortable. And it is a term that frankly has been uncomfortable even for folks who are, criminologists or study criminal legal studies, and definitely for public health folks. But there is a kind of arc to this. Now we use the term police brutality with almost, kind of a sleight of hand. We don't even really think about it. But if you go back about 50 or 60 years ago, in public health, police brutality would have actually shown up as, police are the first responders. So it's not a question of whether there's violence. It's kind of really that police are responding to violence. And in fact, they're saviors. This is an organizational model of police brutality. And in some sense, yes, there are kind of bad apples that may exist, but really whatever you do see is a necessary, kind of tolerance that you need to take for the fact that there are rising levels of crime, and we need to find and control it. In the 90s, we get a shift that happens primarily because the ways in which we saw policing become infused with the social sciences, primarily psychologists who wanted to understand perceptions of injustice, right? As frankly experienced by individuals who are having these different types of contact. So they developed kind of scales of lifetime discrimination, everyday discrimination. And in the lifetime discrimination scales, you actually are able to say, have you ever been treated fairly by the police, da 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 da. So you can actually say, hey, I think I've been treated fairly, but you can actually identify the source of that. And in that space, in the psychological space, policing contact and particularly unfair treatment becomes a stressor. Right now, the stressor could be, today I got stopped, or it could be, I've had a history of being stopped, have the history of being harassed. It could be the fact that I just don't feel like I should be getting stopped. So what's going on? It could be that, frankly, people like me who are the same different kind of group that I am are being stopped. And we really kind of account that to this development within the stress literature for understanding discrimination. But if you go back far enough, probably in the 60s, like 70s, 80s, really the kind of beginning of the social psychology, you actually saw that any contact with any part of the criminal legal system, any part of the judicial system was perceived as something that had an indelible traumatic experience, right? Which is something that you start to see in the early 21st century in public health. You finally get to this idea that in fact, police may actually be part of the crime producing process because they actually are producing violence in the community. So this trauma model has been exported into thinking about adding them together, organizational, psychological, but now we're talking about the community level. So this is kind of where I kind of came into this conversation thinking about police violence. Let me see if this is going to work. Thank you. And, frankly, I did kind of think about it pretty, I would say, neutral in the sense that there's just contact. But at some point in time, you might have a question that maybe that contact actually does feel like violence for the individual. And then now we start to go up that maybe some of this stuff, it really shouldn't happen, even if it's very rare, so which is we get to the lethal kind of surveilled neighborhoods. What we know is that if we look at police violence since the beginning of this kind of trauma model within public health, that at the same time that you've seen a reduction in violence in general and assaults here, these are identified from hospital medical records, you see a reduction in assaults in these acute trauma centers. You actually see an increase in assaults that are related to what we call legal intervention, meaning that, for many reasons, we can say, yes, in fact, it was the police or anyone who actually has the right to enforce the law, and it's during the enforcement of the law. So it's not just the police, right? Which could have been the case with, or it could have been the case that they were or were not enforcing the law. But, in the psychological studies, but the legal intervention is specifically, you're in the act of actually enforcing the law. And it does actually include folks, security guards and so on and so forth. But this is a very specific thing. And it's also documented as a public health record, right? So we see this kind of split. We see a little bit of a gender disparity in here. And it helps me kind of frame our study today, our set of studies today. In 1999, This is kind of early in the year. We were thinking about kind of the beginning of stop, question, frisk policing, but it's actually already underway, and it's primarily underway through these kind of plainclothes policing. And in February 4th, 1999, Amadou Diallo was coming out of his apartment. You can see his face on the bottom right. His mother is who you're seeing in the picture, and he was shot 41 times by New York City Police Department. And the data that we now actually have to actually identify police contact, any contact between any stop that you call as U-250 comes out of the cases that were actually generated from this really unfair killing. They'll tell you here, and there's many stories, but in all cases, they were looking for someone else, right? They were not looking for Amadou Diallo. And he, like many other folks in New York City, have had these kind of patterned interactions. And folks say, we don't even actually have the data to identify whether something like this is, being clear, disproportionately happening, right, in Black and brown neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods. So some of the question that we hear a lot in the media today is about whether it's discriminatory or whether it was tolerable. But the question that we know, okay, do we even know that it's happening at all? The only kinds of data that we had at that point were records that frankly were sealed by the courts. They were for kind of task units who were trying to find drugs, guns, so on and so forth. So we see here in 2002, there was a lawsuit that was actually successful. It was filed, maybe about a couple months after the Diallo shooting, and it was not done by Diallo's family, but it was filed by people who experienced the same thing, right? So we see NYCLU is kind of documenting this data set over time. It's called the New York City Stop, Question, and Frisk database. And we see 97,000 stops, right? Which could have been arguably the beginning of these types of things, ratchet up to over 500,000 stops in 2011. What you see here is this dramatic decline since then. And what we know is that since the lawsuit, this was a lawsuit that actually resulted in Stop, Question, and Frisk being deemed unconstitutional as in its implementation, the style of its implementation in New York City. There was a dramatic slowdown, supposedly in stops, as well as a recording of stops. And eventually, we have this case where if you look at the 2002 to 2020 kind of period, you have over 7 million stops, right? And if you look at this last 5 years, like basically after 2013 or so, you have 50,000 stops that are recorded, right? So we have to ask this question. I ask this question at least. What are we actually looking at? Are we actually looking at stops? Are we looking at the representation of stops? Are we looking at the willingness to identify that you, in fact, engage in these kind of behaviors? But we also have to look at something else, which is, I would say, much more chilling, that we have the court, August 2013, deeming the city of New York Stop, Push, and Frisk unconstitutional. This is not the same Florida as we know today. A different Florida. Again, this is again a part of a different set of. This is a series of lawsuits that are identified by the Center for Constitutional Rights starting in 2003, and we see the progression of these lawsuits using this data, right? With this data, you can identify where the stop is, what time it happened, whether there was anything recovered. You can know whether there was frisking, use of force, whether there were other people who were stopped, questioned, frisked, whether there was a citation or whether there was arrest, and so on and so forth. So it's pretty comprehensive. And a year after we're said, hey, no more stops in New York City, and a year really after you see a crashing, of stops in New York City, we have the suffocation of Eric Garner, right? Now, we would assume that if we were studying police brutality through a trauma model, that something like an Eric Garner case would not happen once you have police stopping the stops, right? But instead, we get this terrible irony that, in fact, you can still have brutality, right? Even when people say, in fact, yes, crime is on the decrease, we're not stopping anymore, so on and so forth. And that's really what the work that I'll show today is. You see here 50,000 stops. If you wanted to do this same kind of study today, it would be I would 100% say it would be very problematic in the inferences, because I wouldn't trust those 50,000 stops. And there has been a slight uptick in 2020. The 2021 data hasn't been released yet, but it's not nearly as, it wouldn't, buffer out that 5, 6, 7 year difference that we've seen. So the argument that I offer in this kind of broader set of conversations that we're having around policing in particular in public health, and then let's bring in those organizational, let's bring in those psychological, let's bring in the sociological aspect of this. And surveillance stress really is a sociological understanding of what stress is. It's not me and you having contact, but it's the entire system of surveillance that is happening. And there's, folks who do surveillance studies, a lot of them outside of sociology, Simone Brown, kind of inside and outside and so on and so forth. But we start from where the psychologists started from, everyday stressors. Then we move up and say, in fact, if you're in one place and it happens all the time, you start to get kind of vigilant. You start trying to maybe feel fearful of the police. You have a climate of fear. You'll see a couple of those things. I won't go into it. I'll focus on one of them. The last one is this, you see it, the perceptions of injustice, discrimination, and what's already done. But the one that I like to think about when I consider these questions from a demography perspective, and particularly from a question of mortality, right? The risk of life expectancy and so on and so forth, is this activating the psychophysiology that happens when people kind of know it happens, but they either don't see it themselves, or they might have heard from it, or maybe they were there, but it didn't happen to them. This is observational for them, they're observers. And what we know from those studies, not in, this stuff that's happening in different kinds of literatures here, we find that if someone hears a baby cry, or someone hears a gunshot, or someone hears a wailing, they'll start to, it's not just that their attention will redirect, but they'll start to kind of perspire, their heart will go up, heart rate will go up, they get a little nervous and so on and so forth. So there's actually an actual physiological reaction to the psychological trauma and stress of actually experiencing these events. And what I might offer is that when you look at this at a global level, which is for us, for me, kind of brought up, we section it off into different parts of the urban ecology. We might consider that some folks who are more likely to be in these kind of spaces where things like stopping the police and aggressive policing are happening, that they're more likely to have, on average, right, that these psychophysiological processes are happening, in addition to the perception of discrimination and the stressors, which we all know are linked to health problems and mental health problems as well. And the vulnerable conditions that are on the table right now, the same vulnerable conditions, frankly, that are implicated in disease progression and severe outcomes for the COVID-19 infections. So I use this data set that we just talked about to create at the neighborhood level these metrics of stop, question, and frisk. These are by neighborhood, and then you look at descriptives across neighborhoods. But we know on average that about 100 residents, there are about 30 of them, there are 30 stops per 100 residents. About over half of those, there's a pat down, there's a frisking. We also know that of those stops, that about 20% of them incur some use of force, and these include, kind of the quote unquote mild, pushing someone against the street, towards, using handcuffs, towards actually pulling your gun out, and so on and so forth. You also have, unfortunately, on the other hand, that Black and Latino residents or pedestrians of New York City, it could or could not be residents, but they're pedestrians walking through the streets of New York City. They're 6 times more likely to be stopped. They're 25% more likely to have a stop involve a frisking, and 28% to include one of 9 different types of use of force. The shortcut here is that if you were to think about this from at the neighborhood level and looking at differences between neighborhoods, a 1 standard deviation change, for instance, in stopping, it gets you about an additional 15 stops per 100 residents. But when you look at frisking, the percentage of frisking that is happening in the stops and the incurring the use of force, it only actually takes 1 New York street block for you to actually see whatever things are happening. It's only 1 block. So I'll kind of walk through this a little bit, but I want you to keep this in mind as you start to see some of these associations. So what I was telling you before, we have these UF 250 administrative records. They're filled in by the police. They've gotten a far more nuance over time. There's even now like, why did you stop, right? So not just what you recovered and so on and so forth. And you can see here the kind of progression that goes from hands, suspects, walls, weapons, batons, handcuffs, all the things that we've been having a conversation about. Rayshard Brooks, we see pepper spray, something kind of shock situation that we're having. The point here is that these, when it comes to use of force, these are fairly, they are traumatic events. I mean, you know, we can talk about what actually is always going to happen with a stop, but then we can also talk about the escalation of those things. We often, when we have this conversation or having a conversation about Eric Garner or Rayshard Brooks, we're having a conversation about a Rakia Boyd. We're having a conversation about even an Oscar Grant in Berkeley and Oakland. And of course, we see folks who are Latino here. We see Indigenous individuals. We see very young girls. We see older kind of more the kind of elder areas. So in some sense, we can say yes, yes. In one sense, you know, after the victims themselves of police brutality are varied, although yes, we can understand there's disparities there, disproportionalities, but we don't really ever have a conversation about is the girl on the left and the bottom who is actually observing these things, right? They grow, that girl grows up in an environment where they may have their, you know, psychophysiological kind of bio kind of space disrupted or disturbed by not even themselves being stopped, right? We know the stop matters for the individual, but living in an area where those things occur. And remember, you just need that additional block. You just need that additional block to see some of these associations, these risks kind of play out. So what I've shown in my own work is fairly kind of, I would say, from the lighthearted things to always definitely the serious things. We just talk about this frisking, that's one additional block of a pat down. We have a 9% increase in diabetes. These numbers, if you were actually doing a public health intervention study, are troubling. We only really need a 10% increase in the risk of something to say, okay, I'm going to go in there and pour a bunch of resources from the United States government to make sure we don't get this thing moving, spreading to the next area, the epidemiological effect. We have 12% increase in diabetes, 17% increase in high blood pressure, 15% increase in asthma episodes. And the one that does show a lot of consistency see is this increase, terrible increase in the risk of obesity. This would generate for us, let's go solve this problem. This would generate, when we look at our own models, okay, I think this is a substance effect. And these are things are happening in the risk factors that don't actually get caught up in this conversation, but you can identify that these are actually risk factors, at least at the kind of organic level, that are creating these vulnerable conditions, these vulnerable physiological profiles, so that when something like a COVID happens, or something like an environmental a flood, for instance, with Hurricane Katrina, when something terrible happens that you can't control, you're walking into that additional trauma with a reduced ability possibly to deal with that additional form of trauma. So we see here diabetes, high blood pressure, asthma, all of these things caught up in the COVID conversation. We also see the other side of this, which is more of the emotional aspect that we do see with this model of surveillance stress. There's a lot of those things that you're going to see are more along the conversations around non-specific psychological distress. We see higher levels of clinical indicators for both that one additional block of frisking, that one additional block of use of force. We see this also, and I'm going to kind of slow down here so we can catch what we're saying here. We see an increase in nervousness, an increase in hopelessness, an increase in worthlessness. I thought it was interesting. You think, okay, it's just anything. No, there are specific types of profiles that are going to come out. So I can imagine that a mother, for instance, is, you know, trying to get to the doctor, you know, hey, that going one, you know, 1 mile, one New York mile, and you have that one block where, you know, reality is New York City people get caught up in stuff. 5 out of those 10 blocks are going to include some kind of frisking. But if it's just 6 out of 10, if on that 10 block walk to the doctor's office, when there's that additional 6 block, they're likely to say, hey, wait a minute. They get on the scale, the women get on the scale and they're obese. If they check their blood pressure, that it's kind of coming in high, that they actually may already be on medication for diabetes and so on and so forth. And then they go home and they feel a little nervous, right? On the way back, that additional block here is with use of forces, you go from kind of 3 out of 4 blocks to 4 out of 4 blocks. You kind of don't feel like you can do anything about these health problems that you have. In fact, you don't really feel like you have anything to contribute to society, or at least to your to areas that you're in contact with. This is a question of worthlessness that you're seeing here. Now, if you're the son of that young boy, that mother, so if you're a young boy, you're the son of that mother, maybe next time when you go to school, you're going to show up, you're going to have an increased risk of these same issues, right? Compared to girls in this neighborhood, right? So again, we're looking at one additional increase in use of force. You see, compared to girls in the same neighborhood, boys are going to have, when they kind of walk to school, and they're probably going to have some indicator on their record that they have clinical levels of non-specific psychological distress. When they go through the medical detector, they're going to seem a little nervous, not a ton of bit, but maybe kind of fidgeting a little bit, which may call some attention to them. Really they're in the math class and they're really trying really hard. It's not really that they don't know mathematics and so on and so forth. It's that they feel, and in reality it takes them a little more effort to kind of put two and two together. They may in that case be marked as someone who has behavioral problems or has slower learning. We actually see this stuff in our statistics independent of what I'm actually telling you. So what I'm offering to you is what we actually see in these statistics that are generally about, behavioral health problems or emotional health problems, vulnerable conditions, or maybe also be associated at risk level. So other things that are far more endemic, as well as offered within this larger kind of sociological frame. Now, one of the things that happens is that it's not just in that school environment that this boy is going to have this effect, and when this woman is walking home, that they're going to have this conversation. But in the end, they get there, they kind of don't feel like they have a lot to contribute to society. So you have a mother who kind of doesn't feel like they have much to consider. You have a son much more than even maybe their sister, kind of not feeling like they have a lot to contribute to society. And we can imagine what kind of effects that has. And I'm referring to effects in a literal sense here in other aspects of their life. We also know from this research that we do see racial differences within a neighborhood. So you can imagine it's a neighborhood, I know it's New York City. So in some sense, that idea of segregation and diversity is maybe misplaced in this sense. But again, we're now scientists. And so we just want to be theoretical in some sense about this, but likely what we see, not for the same levels, right? For Blacks is high stop rate, for Latinx populations is frisk and use of force, but you do see higher levels of high blood pressure. What I think is interesting about this concoction of risk factors is that you have a group that is less likely, number one, to have contact with the police, but also less likely to have health problems, right? Asia Pacific Islanders actually report worse self-rated health when they are in a neighborhood where Black and Latinx populations are treated differently by the police, particularly with issues of use of force. So I would love to sit here and tell you, I really would love to tell you that this is only the problem of those who are already kind of caught up in this vulnerable condition matrix, but we're trying to maybe offer some ideas that maybe it's beyond that. Maybe it's that in different ways, not everybody the same way, but different aspects of society or kind of having their own kind of surveillance stress in their own kind of cultural, economic, structural way. The other part of this that ends up kind of bringing that, frankly, really kind of speaking more to the question around the FLOYD case regarding whether stop, question, and frisk in New York City was disproportionate, is that we've had this longstanding kind of tug in the criminological literature about what actually does structural discrimination look like at the neighborhood level. On one hand, the argument is that when police are targeting an area, here we see these are areas where are much more likely to have Black and Latinos in them, and they're more likely to have that additional use of force risk here. We're going to see higher levels or an increase in the risk as you move up more and more Black and Latinx individuals in a neighborhood of diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, the protective effect of poor or self-rated health actually goes down at a faster pace. What you're looking at here, that solid line, which is kind of where the quote unquote effect is 28% of the pedestrians having force used against them. Whereas what you see is this dotted line, you only have 12%, right? You only have 12%. I say only, but that's kind of where we're talking about. So we do see some associations there, and they do fall within the targeting kind of space. But we also see a race out of place effect where we actually see higher risk of illness in predominantly white communities. I'm going to say that with a little bit of a caveat, because again, we're in New York City. So we're talking about places where, it's basically less than 35% Black and Latinx populations there. You see higher levels of diabetes risk, higher levels of obesity risk and higher levels of high blood pressure. So you're looking at the left of these charts, you're looking again at the solid line, and you're comparing it with, here we're just talking about base load. We've done some recalculations here, but we're looking at actually percentages here, proportions, that what you're looking at. You see, essentially areas, whites who are overexposed to racial differences in use of force. It's the same kind of metric that we saw for Asian Pacific Islanders experiencing worse self-rated health across the board here. When whites, live in these areas, they're actually experiencing more health problem than comparable whites in areas where there's less racial disparities. Here we're looking at, and this is probably one of the sadder parts of it, but that solid line is an area where use of force is 69% more among Black and Latino pedestrians than among white pedestrians. The dotted line, however, is where there's equality. There's only one neighborhood out of 34, and these are really more community areas. They're community kind of health hospital catching areas. There's only one community where you even get close to equality, right? So there is actually no neighborhood community area in New York City where you see Black, Latinx, and white populations, pedestrians being treated equally. In all these cases, Black and Latinx pedestrians are being treated less fairly. So I'll kind of get us to the end of this story around the policing part of it, that one block effect. All it takes is one block is what I'm referring to. We can look at lethally surveilled areas, and lethally surveilled areas we need to understand what we're looking at here. We're talking about, these are by virtue of a medical examiner or coroner, either again by the state or someone that's paid to identify what is in fact the cause of this loss of life, this homicide. So we have, it's used by doctors, emergency professionals at the emergency rooms about what is the source of injury. But we also see it on the other side, actually, if that injury becomes lethal, that you see actual homicides. We have here due to injuries inflicted by police or other law enforcement agents in the course of arrest or attempting to arrest or other legal action. This is an ICD, International Classification Disease identification. You can look at the numbers, you can go there for yourself. It's actually quite comprehensive. There are about 38 or so different kinds. You can even break legal intervention down into its many different kind of parts. But what we know here, if you live in a neighborhood where there are 3 or more of these types of deaths identified within the 10 years prior to the fall, right? Prior to the fall of stop, question, and frisk, that any individuals with that 3 or more versus anything, either 0, which is about, 25 or 30% of neighborhoods is where there's nothing, but you do have a scattering of neighborhoods where there's 1, or, this is 10 years, mind you, every other year or so, every 3 or 4 years, you see something. They have a higher risk of both high blood pressure and obesity for those individuals living in that 3+ neighborhood area. If you only look at women, right, and you compare women who are living in these lethally surveilled areas versus women who are living in less lethally surveilled areas, you see a greater risk of obesity. But if you compare women and men in the same neighborhood, so you're now looking at lethally surveilled neighborhoods, 3 or more, versus those that are not that, you're looking at women, men in lethally surveilled neighborhoods, you're looking at the relative risk of the CVD trifecta. This is diabetes, high blood pressure, and obesity compared to those women versus men who are living in areas that are lethally surveilled. This is one of the more shocking parts, because often at times the conversation, when you actually really consider the question of gender here, does not consider like a kind of a conversation around women in the sense of not victims. The question we probably have really now is, which victims do we attend to? But we see here a question of these kind of a collateral. I really think of this as collateral damage, right? These are collateral damage in the sense that you have folks who are left behind. Who takes care of these families where people have a loss of life? Who have individuals who are incarcerated and so on and so forth? We know that neighborhoods where there's more incarceration have higher risk of asthma. We know that areas where there's more incarceration, we see a CBD list. This happens even down at the individual level. Of course, we know that. But to understand this conversation around surveillance stress more broadly, we have to consider that really in all of these different areas, we're seeing these questions And the last one I'll say, let's say we actually do get to the emergency, we do get to the hospital. We know that we have problems, and you're in a place, maybe in undue stress, and you really need to go to emergency room. You maybe have heart palpitations. You don't know what's going on. What we know is if you live in these areas where there's less frisking happening in them. This is actually data from Philadelphia. It's the same metric. It shows up to be the same standard deviation reduction, different the metro area, but kind of unfortunately, again, the same kind of associations. You're less likely to go to the emergency room. You're less likely to visit it within the last year. So this is where we kind of think about this. For me, this is where I kind of consider the question of, yes, there are lethally surveilled neighborhoods. We have these kind of period of cycles, right? And when you see maybe it's a reflection of public policy or something else, let's say something else that are going on. These are not isolated events. We have 1999, right? We have Amadou Diallo, we have Rodney King, we have the riots, the Red Summers, Detroit, right? We have these things that have happened, and in a lot of the conversations we have, it particularly when it comes to boiling points in conflict between police and primarily areas that are racially residentially segregated. We have the question of kind of at some point in time, it's too much. So what I wanted to think about was this conversation that I had around the targeting issue and the outer place issue, and thinking about it in the conversation that we've been having around lethally surveilled neighborhoods, a place where we have right now, George Floyd was choked to death. These are not areas where they didn't happen before. We see the same thing with Ferguson. These are areas where people kind of know this could happen, right? The police were sitting, they were at that corner, so on and so forth. So one way to consider this is at a historical level, considering that these are spaces that maybe we're actually seeing what I call a legacy effect. We're looking at two different things here. I'll start from the right and then go left. On the right side is recent data on ethno-racial composition in the United States. This is Minneapolis. I'm going to give you kind of an example here, but also kind of where does this stuff go beyond just telling you police matter, or they don't matter, or they do matter, this is how they matter. Let's think about this actually, again, from me, an organizational perspective, a policy issue. We have a very segregated city. We have Black and Latinos in the green and the red, whites kind of around this area. This is an area that basically, defines what segregation is, one of the most segregated cities in the Midwest, so on and so forth. And we're going to try to do a mapping here. We're going to go about 80 years before this, or 70 years in this case before this, and look at these same areas, a much more targeted area here that were identified by the government, or they were asked by the government, are these areas worth investing in? Right? These are what they call the HOCO maps, or the home owner loan corporation. Folks would come out, they were employed or paid, shall we say, by the government to say, I think this neighborhood is deserving of loans. This one, not worth it, or it's too risky, so on and so forth. And they create these grades, this 4-scale grade, and areas that were quote unquote redlined. These are areas that basically were locked out of the home ownership wealth cycle for 50, 60 years. I mean, you really don't see a better, I would say better distribution until you get into the late 90s or so on and so forth. But we know if we take the 2010 and we compare it back to the 1937, it's not that there hasn't been an increase in the diversity of, for instance, Black and Latinos, for instance, into Minneapolis, but the areas that were red in the 30s, those are the areas where Blacks and Latinos essentially being funneled into. Those areas that were green, that would say, I think this is a great place for us to invest. Those areas have basically stayed the same when it comes to the representation of Blacks in here in those areas, have changed very little. So you can see the maps here. This is data that's coming from the University of Minnesota's libraries. You can also say, you take this 1980, these every decade up until 2010, and you look at actual racial covenants. So I'm actually going to map, we're kind of pulling a couple things together. We're going to take that, before it was the Hulk maps and we have the racial composition. Now we have racial composition and we have a covenants. This is really cool data. There's data like this in DC. There's other places that are digging this kind of data up. But this data is at the parcel level. This is per building, right? Per lot, find a property line and put a chain fence around it. This is where you're at. Were you able, for instance, to get a house there to move in, so on and so forth? And we're looking at what we're doing here. You see these darker blue ones. The darker they go, you have areas that are more and more Black residents per all individuals in the neighborhood. And the areas, right, that are much lighter, our areas basically have less than 10% of Blacks. And you can see these little parcels that here, a lot of these parcels in areas that have very few of Blacks in the area today. You know, we'll skip tomorrow, but today, right? Now, what's on these racial covenants? Racial covenants are not unique to Minneapolis. They're part of, they're literally like a business contract that are between someone who buys a house and someone who sells a house. It could be also between someone who owns a house and someone is leasing a house. But one of them, for instance, says it is further stipulated and agreed by and between the parties heretofore themselves, their heirs and assigns as part of the consideration hereof, that within described premises shall not be sold, mortgaged, or leased to or occupied by any persons or persons other than members of the Caucasian race. I would love to sit there and tell you that people are not actually considering race at this point in time, but not only are they considering race, but they're looking at it in a white, non-white space. White is the only category in the census that have been measured every year, every decade, the same way. We also have other versions of this. A version that we're looking at here, no persons of any other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled within owner or tenant. No trailer, basement, tent, shack, garage, barn, or other outbuilding erected in the tract shall at any time be used as a residence, temporarily or permanently, nor shall any structure of a temporary character be used as a residence, meaning I don't want you on the property unless you're working for me, right? That's what that last little caveat in the E thing said, unless you're working for me, not there. Again, you see a clear racialization, and it is along this kind of vertical hierarchy of worth here. So I just showed you a section here of this map. And what I did, I was just like, I wonder where is this intersection? I want to know, and where are these covenants? So I looked at the covenants in relationship to what I knew, at least, which was George Floyd Square, which you can see on the right side, is the corner store that he was interacting with, doing exchanges with, in the space where he was choked to death. This is the one area that, despite all the riots and so on and so forth, it was literally untouched. Individuals protected the area, so on and so forth. And so we think about this as a site, really as a concretization site, a memorial site. And I wanted to know, what was this site's relationship to these other kinds of things, these other type of homeowning the dynamics that are happening. I wanted to focus on the intersection itself. Is East 38th Street and the Chicago Avenue. So East 38th Street is going from east to west, Chicago Avenue north to south. If you take that corner and you go down 10 blocks, I would love to tell you I made this up. I did the studies on New York City and Philadelphia some time ago. This is something that just happened maybe, not even 2 years ago. If you take 10 blocks down, you'll find that corner that you were looking at before, where there are tons of restrictive covenants. On the covenant on the street of 47th and the 47th and Chicago Avenue. So that means you walk down, this is block 8, this is block 9, and here is your 10th block. There's a building right under a parcel that says the Caucasian race one, right? So you can go and read it. The person who sold the property was Shenandoah Terrace Company. They were essentially developing a suburb, which is all those parcels that you see have the same covenant on them. The person who signed the contract was Harry W. Williams. And I want you to focus on these dates really quick. 1925, the contract expired, right? So this is actually before you actually see the loan officers, the loan corporation kind of surveyors come into the area. This is 47. I'm not trying to find my, okay. I'm trying to find my cursor here, but this is 4701 Chicago Avenue. And I want to think about today, what is on 4701 Chicago Avenue. I wanted to find out, where was this building? What did they do with it? And what we found is that this building today at 4701 Chicago Avenue is called Wings Federal Credit Union. It's a credit union. And across the street from it on the same block is Wells Fargo Bank. On the same block, a little bit further down, there's a healthcare center. There's a ton of food there. And if you looked at that, the intersection that you saw for George Floyd, these are not the same kinds of food spaces, right? You have a park right there that actually essentially restricts home development from going south, for instance, and also from going east. So this is what happens 100 years after, so to speak, 100 years after this racial covenant expired, right? It expired. And these are also what's happening basically about 80 years after this area was deemed green. Where it's like, hey, let's put the money in there. And you see the effects of that. You literally see the money, right? I don't have to paint a building green. I don't have to paint a cross-section green. I can just look at who owns and is operating out of that building today. You see Wings Financial Credit Union. This is actually what it looks like. There's actually no house there. When there's no house there, there's a commercial building. You see Wells Fargo, very nice parking lots, very clean, so on and so forth. You see Health Partners Clinic, an urgent care, again, that woman walking down that extra block. So we have this kind of dual kind of issue here. We have that additional block, both takes you to opportunity, and it also represents an additional association of risk. That's a conversation to be had, but I just wanted to kind of put this here. The Wings Financial Credit Union was founded in 1938 by 7 airline employees. It's kind of Northwestern Airlines at that time. You have the whole security maps that are drawn in 1937. Again, the expiration of that restrictive covenant in 1925. I'm here for a lot of conversations, but I think this is a conversation. How do you solve that problem, right? How do you solve, again, that's a conversation to have. I do think it's a conversation to have. I want to focus on one thing. People's like, why did I use the term all it takes is one block? There's a song by Nas, is 2001, right around all this time, this Amadou Diallo time, called One Mic. And what he's saying is, all I need is one mic, all I need is one life, one try, one breath. I'm one person. All I need is one mic to spread my voice to the whole world. If you look at this video, this is him, he's telling the song, and in the back is a police officer chasing 3 guys who were sitting in the car, and they saw the police come and they started running. This is a life, right, that is happening in these areas, that additional one block, in this case, going north. And the individuals who are seeing this stuff, yes, are the victims, but the individuals who are oftentimes bearing the brunt of those, the living effects, the health effects of those that are living through this are this girl that's looking out and folks from her family. I'll stop there. I think we are at an hour. You just got us to 1:29. So we have 1 minute. Oh, we have 1 minute. Well, man, there we go. There we go.
But amazing. And we did have one question in the Q&A chat. But I just wanted to, give you a round of applause. Thank you so much. That was beyond measure amazing talk. Frank Edwards, I can bring Frank into the chat, and just so you know, people may roll off because they have to go to class or other things, but I'm going to bring Frank into the conversation.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Fantastic. I obviously love the work and have for a long time. So I had a narrow question about the ICD-10 code for legal intervention and your thoughts about the validity of that and whether you think there might be group-specific bias. So obviously, sorry that we got kids in the background, but the ICD-10 codes, I was curious if you thought that there might be group-specific bias. So obviously, right, ICD-10, if there's no group-specific bias, that it's the legal intervention death code, it would be correlated with actual rates of violence. But I'm wondering if you have any reason to suspect there might be differences in that bias across groups. I'm thinking about the validity of using it, and I've explored it in my own work. And I'm also curious if you could talk briefly about how you think about modeling these kinds of historical processes with contemporary health outcomes.
Yeah, this is good. I would love to sit here and talk to you. Again, also a friend of your work. I cite you all the time. So the first one is a really good question around just the cleanliness and bias of that actual measure. So I think it's a good measure. It's not a perfect measure. Number one, this is a doctor kind of trained to say, at a physiological level, what is medically possible. Well, we know there is actually a correlation between that measure and the fatal encounters measure. It's strong, right? But there are actually areas where the doctors find more legal intervention deaths than the journalists do, which I find interesting. I'm like, I thought we had it all right there. So there is something going on here that is, I do think is accurate, but you see the same distribution, right, across the neighborhood. So the counts can vary, but the distribution is exactly the same. We do account for we account for robbery complaints. When you do homicides, it's really too correlated with racial segregation, frankly. And we still see this quote unquote association regardless of crime. You are right about this, that there's going to be an association between crime. I think if you wanted to do this kind of modeling, you need to look at some kind of interaction effect so you can pull apart what's actual crime, what's actual just contact, and what's actually something that is feeding itself, or there's a kind of vicious cycle that's going on. Historically is a great question. It is something that I'm working on. I think you can do the normal kind of regression neighborhood effects analysis, but I actually think at some point in time, you really want to consider pathway stuff. And I actually don't think about this from a structural equation modeling perspective. I think about the growing of neighborhoods, right? So if I were looking at this, I wouldn't actually just look at it happened in 1920s, it happened in 1930s, it happened in 2010s. I would actually look at how these neighborhoods are actually changing across time as a reaction with the framework that they're actually reacting, right? They're reacting to those neighborhoods. That graph that you saw from the University of Minnesota's library, where you see as individuals who are ethno-racially marginalized come into an area, they're being stuck, right? They're being stuck in these neighborhoods that were historically a disadvantage on the basis of race, right? I also want to just caveat this is that this data on racial covenants is there. These things are actually being made during Black Reconstruction, right? So this is what is racial covenants is essentially whites' reaction to we have an emancipated population. They're not coming over here. I think those are dynamics that are frankly beyond our kind of standard regression techniques, and then also the regression techniques should be able to see them. It's an association, but I don't think the regression techniques as we see them, even neighborhood effects models, even spatial autocorrelation models, I don't think they do very well what would be a structural epigenetic effect, right? The genetic is not the individual, but it's the genes of the neighborhood. The genes of racism in the neighborhood is I would say a different way of thinking about it, but I do think it's useful. I'll cut it there.
I'm really don't want to shortchange our students who are so desperate to have a chance to visit with you, and their time is now. So I thank you so much, Ali. It was fantastic. I had one little thought I'll leave, which is doing something like with those historic trends, using the data to create a sequence analysis of a cascading set of patterns, so that you could see different sequencing of piling on or cascading outcomes, and see how that relates to subsequent.
Yep. I think at analytical level, I think at analytical level that looks a lot closer to what I think about.
Yeah. And people have done that with life course studies and the like. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
Sarah, I'm gonna tag on to your comment a little bit, Sarah.
Sure. Excuse me, Lashonda. Yeah.
Dr. Sewell, amazing work. And I'm also thinking about the ways in which these neighborhoods have also been targeted more in the last, several decades for subprime loans. And so that's also something that could be layered onto the risk factor in this neighborhood. And there's a racial geography for the second punitive institution that we deal with which is the child welfare system. And so I just imagine that that's also a really interesting way to think about that. This isn't just historical, this is right now.
That's interesting. Yes.
Thank you.
That's so great. That great comment, Lashonda. Okay, well, hopefully we can convince you to come back, Ali.
Like I will tell you, exactly what I thought was happening. Everything, all the batteries are dead and everything. So I will log off and come into a different.
Okay. Do you have what you need? Because the Zoom, I've copied
the same link.
No, it's a different link. So I'll send it to you on email.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll figure out what's going on here. I'll be right back.
All right. Bye-bye.